I taught ESL online for a couple of years to Chinese students. And I mention that because a lot of the lessons that I taught online incorporated Chinese mythological or real figures. That's only to state that I know a little bit more about Chinese history than the average high school Western student. It's not a lot, it's just a little bit in that I know the names. This is important because when I read Zachary Ying and the Dragon Emperor by Shirin J. Zhao, I was expecting out of a Percy Jackson meets Avatar meets The Last Airbender meets The Last Starfighter kind of vibe after the first chapter. In theory, there's a lot to love about this book because you've got a young kid who's about 12, maybe 13, and an ancient Chinese spirit wants to meld with his physical body to propel him to do something. But unfortunately for this Chinese emperor spirit, it melds with the young kid's virtual reality headset instead of the real person. That's all good and well because a lot of the kids are playing this very popular game that incorporates mythical figures using VR headsets. There's a lot going for this book, but there's so much going for it that it manages to step over everything without being a great book. And that's partially because the characters go too deep into Chinese history. For example, whenever Zach tries to actually get something going, he meets another person or another avatar who has been co-opted by a Chinese spirit. And when that happens, a little bloop, a little placard pops over that person that says, "Oh, it's whoever. It's Ling Pao who's doing this," or the Chinese poet whose name I forget. Ling Bao, I think it's his name. I'm forgetting my Chinese history. But the placard pops over them and it says, "Hey, here are their strengths. Here's where they were born, and here's what they're known for." So when they battle or something, you know what the pros and cons are going to be. And the problem is, whenever these two things meet, these two spirits that have co-opted people, they go into these tangents about well, back in my day, and it's too much history, and it's not enough fun to read. The best example I came up with when I was writing this was, imagine somebody didn't know anything about American history. And for today's state of education, that's not too far of a stretch. But here's a great example. Let's say George Washington and Thomas Edison. They meet each other in avatar form. Now, these are two cats who didn't really have a lot in common. They didn't even live in the same time period. But let's say they meet in Avatar Land. What would they deal with? How would they what would their strengths be? And they would just talk smack or talk great things about each other. And if you didn't know anything about American history, you would say, "That's great, I'm reading about my character who's been co-opted by George Washington, yet I'm still trying to catch up on my character and I don't really care who George Washington is." Put that into the world of Chinese mythology, and you've got to look at what Zachary Ying and the Dragon Emperor is. As a book, it tries to set up its sequel before establishing the first book also. It ends on a cliffhanger, and we're cool with cliffhanger books. Those books that have endings that say, but then what happens next? And that's kind of how this book ends. But the problem is, most readers may not care about the main characters because it wasn't really flushed out well enough in this book because it's a little confusing. If you really dig Chinese history and you know it, like say you're a middle school kid and you're down with Chinese history and you know a bit of the pros and cons about it, then this could be your jam. However, for most readers, it could be a little confusing, and your reading time could be better spent elsewhere. This is Trey with Daddy Mojo.